"You'll embarrass me if you walk into that ballroom tonight," my husband said quietly, adjusting his tie in the mirror of the hotel suite as if the words meant nothing at all. I remember the way the crystal lights from the hallway reflected in the glass behind him, turning the room bright and cold at the same time. The Grand Lakeshore Hotel in downtown Chicago was hosting the biggest celebration of his career that evening, a gala for investors and executives from across the country, and every elevator in the building seemed to be carrying people in tuxedos and glittering gowns. My husband Robert had spent months preparing for this night. I had spent 40 years helping him get here. But as he turned toward the door, he paused and looked at me again, his expression tightening just slightly, the way it did when he was about to say something he had already decided I wouldn't like. "It's just better if you stay in the lounge area for a while," he said. "These people are important investors. I need everything to look polished." I didn't answer right away. After 4 decades of marriage, I had learned that silence was sometimes the only response worth giving. I smoothed the sleeve of my navy dress, the same one I had worn to church the previous spring, and nodded once as if his request were perfectly reasonable. "Of course," I said quietly. "Whatever you think is best." Robert seemed relieved, like a problem had just solved itself without requiring any effort from him. He picked up his phone, glanced at the time, and headed toward the door. "I won't be long," he added. "Just stay here for now." Then he was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of his expensive cologne and the muffled sound of laughter drifting up from the ballroom 2 floors below. The lounge he had mentioned turned out to be a small service sitting area behind the main event hall, a quiet room with 2 leather chairs, a coffee table, and a window that looked out over the city lights stretching along Lake Michigan. From where I sat, I could hear the distant music from the gala band, the clinking of glasses, and the low hum of conversations that belonged to a world I apparently wasn't meant to enter. I folded my hands in my lap and waited, watching. The minute hand on the clock above the doorway moved slowly around its circle. 40 years earlier, Robert and I had started his company in our garage with nothing more than a borrowed desk and a second-hand computer. I used to type his proposals late at night after finishing my shift at the bank. I used to answer customer calls while cooking dinner. I used to believe that when success finally arrived, we would stand in the spotlight together. But somewhere along the way, success had decided it only needed one of us. I was still thinking about that when the door to the lounge opened quietly behind me. I expected it to be a hotel employee or perhaps someone who had taken a wrong turn on the way to the ballroom. Instead, an older man stepped inside wearing a tailored black suit and the calm confidence of someone accustomed to being recognized wherever he went. He paused when he saw me sitting by the window, studying my face in a way that made me feel strangely familiar to him. For several seconds he said nothing at all. Then his expression changed. Not with confusion, but with something closer to recognition, like a person finally locating a long-lost photograph they had spent years trying to find. He walked toward me slowly, his eyes never leaving my face, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who had just solved a mystery decades in the making. "Margaret Hayes," he said gently, "I can't believe it's really you. I've been searching for you for 30 years. I stared at him for a moment, convinced I must have misunderstood what he said. The name Margaret Hayes was not exactly rare in America, and for 30 years I had lived a quiet life that did not usually attract the attention of powerful executives in expensive suits. The man standing in front of me, however, did not look uncertain. If anything, his expression held the calm satisfaction of someone who had finally solved a puzzle that had bothered him for decades. Up close I noticed the silver in his hair, and the small lines around his eyes that usually appear only on people who carry a great deal of responsibility. I had seen that face before, although not in person. His photograph had appeared many times in business magazines that Robert used to leave scattered around the house. Daniel Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore Technologies, a company worth billions of dollars and growing every year. The kind of man my husband hoped to impress tonight. For a moment, I wondered whether he had mistaken me for someone else. That would have been the simplest explanation. "I think you might have the wrong person," I said gently. "I am afraid I have not been very easy to find because no one has been looking." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly in a quiet smile. "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "I know exactly who you are. Margaret Hayes from the old Lakeside Community Bank branch on Maple Street. You used to sit at the desk near the window with the yellow mug that said Chicago Cubs. Hearing those details felt like someone opening a door to a room I had not entered in many years. The bank on Maple Street had closed nearly 3 decades earlier, back when online banking was still a strange new idea and most people still filled out deposit slips by hand. I had worked there for almost 15 years, helping small business owners apply for loans that larger banks often refused to consider. It had been honest work. Quiet work. The kind of job that rarely appeared in anyone else's success story. I looked at Daniel again, searching his face for some hint that he was joking, but there was none. His voice softened slightly as he continued. You probably do not remember me. Back then, I was a nervous man in my early 30s with a briefcase full of sketches and a business idea no one believed in. I walked into that branch 6 different times asking for a meeting with someone who would at least read my proposal. Slowly, the memory began to take shape in my mind like a photograph coming into focus. A young man with restless energy. A folder full of diagrams and handwritten numbers. A dream that sounded far too ambitious for the small office he had walked into that day. Most of the managers had been too busy to listen to him. Some of them had quietly suggested he try a larger institution downtown instead. But I had asked him to sit down and explain his idea anyway. At the time, it had not seemed like anything extraordinary. It had simply been the decent thing to do. You were the only person who did not laugh at the proposal, Daniel continued. You stayed an hour after closing time while I explained how the software would work. You told me that every great company begins with someone brave enough to believe in an impossible idea. I felt the faintest warmth rise in my chest, not from pride, but from the strange realization that a moment I had almost forgotten had clearly meant far more to someone else. I remember the conversation, I said quietly, but I did not do anything remarkable. I only introduced you to the loan officer who handled small business accounts. Daniel let out a soft breath that sounded almost like a quiet laugh. You did more than that. You wrote a short note on the top of my application recommending that they take the meeting seriously. That note helped me secure the first $25,000 credit line that allowed me to build my first prototype. Without it, Whitmore Technologies would never have existed. The words hung in the air between us, heavier than the distant music drifting from the ballroom down the hall. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he glanced toward the closed door leading to the gala and then back at me with a curious expression. Which raises a question I have been trying to understand since I walked into this room, he said slowly. Why is the woman who helped start my entire career sitting alone in a service lounge while the rest of the city celebrates in that ballroom tonight? I looked at the closed ballroom doors for a moment before answering him. Through the thick wood and velvet curtains, we could still hear the distant sound of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the polished voice of a jazz singer drifting through the hallway. It sounded like the kind of celebration people imagine when they think of success. Bright lights, expensive suits, important conversations. The world my husband had spent 40 years trying to reach. I folded my hands calmly on my lap and gave a small shrug. It is my husband's event, I said. He prefers that I stay out of the way tonight. Daniel Whitmore studied my face carefully, as if he were trying to understand whether I was joking. When he realized I was not, the expression in his eyes changed slightly. It was not anger or disbelief. It was something quieter than that. Something closer to disappointment. Your husband, he repeated slowly. The host of this gala? I nodded. Robert Hayes. Daniel's eyebrows lifted almost immediately. The name clearly meant something to him. Robert Hayes is the founder of Hayes Digital Logistics, he said thoughtfully. We have met several times over the past few years. I did not realize. His voice trailed off as he glanced around the small lounge again, taking in the empty chairs, the dim lamp on the side table, and the quiet hallway outside the door. Then he looked back at me with a puzzled half smile. I did not realize he was married to the woman who helped launch my career. I felt a soft breath escape my chest, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Most people do not realize that, I replied gently. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Somewhere down the hallway, a server pushed a rolling cart past the door, the wheels humming softly against the carpet. The sounds of the ballroom grew louder for a second when the main doors opened, and then faded again when they closed. Daniel rested one hand lightly on the back of the chair across from me, but did not sit down. May I ask you something, Margaret? He said after a moment. Of course. Did your husband ask you to stay here tonight? The question was simple, but there was a careful weight behind it. The way people speak when they already suspect the answer. I considered my words for a second before replying. Robert believes that business events require a certain image, I said calmly. He prefers to handle them on his own. Daniel tilted his head slightly, as if turning the idea over in his mind. Image, he repeated quietly. Then he gave a small thoughtful nod. I suppose many executives worry about that sort of thing. I watched the city lights through the window beside me. From 12 floors up the streets looked like narrow ribbons of gold stretching along the lakefront, and the traffic below moved slowly like a distant river of red and white lights. For a long time, that view had represented the future Robert dreamed about. Big offices, powerful clients, national attention. Everything he believed would finally prove that our years of sacrifice had been worth it. Robert worked very hard to build his company, I said softly. Tonight means a great deal to him. Daniel did not respond right away. Instead, he looked again toward the ballroom doors at the end of the hallway. The band had begun playing a slower piece now, and the music floated faintly through the corridor. Finally, he turned back toward me, his expression thoughtful but steady. Margaret, he said, when I walked into this room tonight, I expected to meet the man hosting the event. Instead, I found the person who made it possible for my own company to exist. He paused for a moment, then added quietly, and I cannot help noticing that the most important person I have seen all evening is sitting alone in a service lounge. I gave a small smile, the kind that comes from many years of learning how to accept things without complaint. Life has a funny way of arranging people's places, I said gently. Daniel studied me again for several seconds, and something in his expression grew firmer, like a decision slowly settling into place. Then he glanced once more toward the ballroom doors, where the music and conversation continued to flow as if nothing unusual were happening just a few steps away. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet certainty that made the hallway suddenly feel smaller. I think, he said slowly, that arrangement might be about to change. I remained seated for a moment after he said those words, unsure whether he truly meant them or whether they were simply the polite instincts of a successful executive who disliked seeing someone sitting alone. Daniel Whitmore, however, did not look like a man who made casual statements. The calm focus in his eyes suggested that when he decided something should happen, it usually did. He stepped toward the door of the lounge and paused with his hand resting lightly on the handle, then glanced back at me as if offering a quiet invitation rather than an order. Margaret, he said, his voice warm but firm, I believe it is time you joined the celebration. I felt a small hesitation rise inside me, the same quiet instinct that had guided me through years of standing behind Robert rather than beside him. I do not want to cause any trouble, I said gently. Tonight is very important for my husband. Daniel gave a thoughtful smile, the kind that suggested he had spent many years observing how people protect others even when they themselves are overlooked. I understand that, he replied. But I also believe that important nights should include the people who made them possible. For a second I considered refusing again. Habit is a powerful thing, especially when it has shaped decades of your life. But there was something steady and respectful in the way he spoke that made it difficult to argue. Slowly I stood from the chair beside the window. The soft carpet muffled my footsteps as I crossed the small room toward him. Up close I could hear the music from the ballroom more clearly now. The band had started playing an upbeat swing tune, and the rhythm of conversation and laughter carried down the hallway like a warm current of sound. Daniel opened the door and stepped aside, allowing me to walk beside him rather than behind him. That small gesture alone felt strangely unfamiliar. For years I had grown used to standing slightly out of sight during Robert's business events, appearing only when photographs required it or when someone asked politely whether he had family. Tonight was different. We walked down the corridor together toward the large double doors leading into the gala. 2 hotel staff members stood nearby managing the flow of guests. The moment they recognized Daniel Whitmore, both of them straightened instantly. One of them pushed the doors open without being asked. Warm golden light poured into the hallway, along with the bright hum of hundreds of conversations happening at once. Inside the ballroom the scene looked exactly the way Robert had imagined when he planned this evening. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, reflecting light across dozens of round tables covered in white linen. Waiters moved smoothly between guests carrying trays of sparkling water and champagne. A large digital screen near the stage displayed the Hayes Digital Logistics logo above the words Annual Investor Celebration. I spotted Robert almost immediately near the center of the room. He stood beside a tall man in a navy suit who appeared to be one of the investors he had mentioned earlier that evening. Robert was speaking confidently, his hands moving in practiced gestures as he explained something about market expansion and distribution networks. For a moment, he did not notice us entering. Daniel slowed his pace slightly as we walked forward through the crowd. Conversations around us began to quiet the moment people recognized him. It was subtle at first, just a few curious glances, but within seconds several heads turned in our direction. A few guests even stepped aside instinctively, creating a small path through the room. Robert finally looked up in our direction. At first his expression held the polite smile he used when greeting new investors. Then his eyes shifted past Daniel and landed on me. The change in his face was immediate. Surprise came first, followed by a quick flash of confusion. It was the look of someone trying to understand how a carefully planned evening had suddenly taken a turn he did not expect. Daniel stopped walking about 10 feet away from him. The music from the band continued in the background, but the conversations nearby had grown noticeably quieter. Robert forced a small laugh and stepped forward quickly, his voice cheerful but slightly tight around the edges. "Daniel," he said, extending his hand. "I did not realize you had arrived already." Daniel shook his hand politely, then glanced at me before answering. "I arrived a few minutes ago," he said calmly. "Although I believe the most interesting part of my evening happened in a small lounge down the hall." Robert's smile faltered just slightly as he followed Daniel's gaze back toward me, clearly realizing that the quiet arrangement he had made earlier that night was no longer quite so invisible. Robert's hand was still halfway extended when Daniel finished speaking, and for a moment the two men stood there in a quiet pause that seemed to stretch longer than the music playing behind them. I watched my husband carefully. I had known Robert Hayes for more than 40 years, long enough to recognize every expression that crossed his face. The quick calculations behind his eyes told me he was already trying to decide how to manage this unexpected situation in front of his investors. Robert recovered quickly, as he always did in business settings. He forced a confident smile and gestured politely toward the group of men standing behind him. "Well," he said with a light laugh, "I am glad you found your way to the event. Let me introduce you to some of our partners." Daniel did not immediately move. His attention remained calmly fixed on Robert for a moment longer before he spoke again in that same steady voice. "In a moment," he said, "but first I would like to finish a conversation I started down the hall." Robert's smile tightened slightly. Around us the nearby guests had begun to watch more openly now. When a figure as recognizable as Daniel Whitmore paused in the center of the room, people naturally became curious about the reason. Robert glanced briefly toward me, then back to Daniel, clearly hoping the subject would move somewhere safer. "Of course," he replied. "What were you discussing?" Daniel turned slightly toward me, his expression warm but respectful, the same way someone might acknowledge an old colleague rather than a stranger. "I was explaining to Margaret how much her advice helped me when I was trying to secure my first business loan 30 years ago." The words floated easily across the small circle of listeners, but their effect was immediate. Robert blinked once as if he had misheard something. "Her advice?" he repeated carefully. Daniel nodded. "Yes, at a small community bank on Maple Street. She was the only person who took my proposal seriously when I was just starting out." A few of the investors nearby exchanged curious looks. Some of them clearly knew Daniel well enough to understand that he did not exaggerate stories about his early career. Robert shifted his weight slightly, the polished calm he usually carried beginning to slip just enough for me to notice. "That must have been a long time ago," he said, attempting another casual laugh. "Margaret used to work at a bank before our company took off." Daniel's eyes moved back toward Robert with calm interest. "Yes," he said, "and I still remember the exact number written on the first line of the credit application she helped me complete." He paused briefly, almost as if savoring the memory. $25,000. One of the investors standing beside Robert raised his eyebrows slightly. In the world of major corporate investments, that number sounded almost quaint, but everyone in business understood the truth behind it. "Every empire begins with a first step," Daniel continued, his voice carrying easily through the quiet circle that had formed around us. "It may not sound like much today, but that small credit line allowed me to build the first working version of the software platform that eventually became Whitmore Technologies. A few more heads turned in our direction now. Even the band seemed quieter for a moment between songs. Robert glanced around the room, clearly realizing that more people were listening than he had expected. "Well," he said, trying to steer the conversation back towards safer ground, "Margaret has always been very supportive of people with good ideas." Daniel looked at him thoughtfully for a second. "Supportive is one way to describe it," he replied calmly. Then he turned his attention back toward the guests who had gathered nearby. "But the truth is simpler than that. Without Margaret Hayes, my company would never have existed." The sentence hung in the air like the sudden stillness before a storm. I felt several pairs of eyes shift toward me at once. People who had never noticed my presence 10 seconds earlier were now studying my face with open curiosity. Robert's expression froze just slightly. I could see the precise moment when he realized that the quiet arrangement he had made earlier that evening had begun to unravel in front of the very audience he had worked so hard to impress. For a moment, no one in the ballroom spoke. The silence that followed Daniel's words felt heavier than the music that had filled the room just seconds earlier. I could almost hear the quiet shifting of attention as people tried to understand what they had just heard. Several investors who had been standing behind Robert were now looking directly at me, their expressions curious rather than dismissive. Robert cleared his throat softly, the sound small but noticeable in the sudden stillness. I knew that gesture well. It was the one he used whenever a conversation was drifting outside the direction he wanted. "Daniel," he said with a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes, "that is very generous of you to say. Margaret has always been supportive of everyone around her." Daniel studied him for a moment, not unkindly, but with the calm patience of someone who did not feel rushed by the room or by the expectations hanging in the air. "Supportive is not quite the word I would choose," he replied. His voice was steady and clear, and several more guests had turned their chairs slightly so they could listen. Daniel glanced briefly toward the large screen above the stage where the Hayes Digital Logistics logo glowed softly in blue and silver light. Then he looked back at Robert. 30 years ago, I was a young engineer with an idea that most banks refused to even read. I had already been turned away by 3 institutions downtown and 2 more on the north side of Chicago. Every loan officer told me the same thing. The concept was too risky. The numbers were too uncertain. A few of the investors nodded slowly. Anyone who had built a company from the ground up recognized that story. Daniel continued speaking calmly, his voice carrying easily across the nearby tables. "When I walked into the Maple Street branch that afternoon, I expected the same answer again. I remember thinking I would give up if one more person told me my idea would never work." He paused and glanced toward me with a quiet smile that held a warmth I had not felt in a long time. But Margaret did something different. She asked me to sit down and explain the plan from the beginning. The memory drifted back into my mind as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. A young man with a stack of papers, nervous but determined, describing a software system that could organize shipping routes more efficiently than anything on the market at the time. I had not understood every technical detail he mentioned, but I had understood the conviction in his voice. Daniel continued. "After the bank closed that evening, she stayed with me for nearly an hour going through every page of my proposal. She asked questions that none of the loan officers had bothered to ask. And then she wrote a short note recommending that the application should be reviewed seriously instead of dismissed." I noticed several heads turning toward Robert now, as if people were beginning to realize how closely the story connected to the man hosting the evening. Robert's smile had become noticeably tighter. His eyes flicked around the room briefly before returning to Daniel. "Well," he said carefully, "I am glad someone at that bank recognized potential when they saw it." Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging the comment without letting it redirect the moment. "Yes," he said, "she recognized potential. But more importantly, she treated a stranger with respect when no one else did." He let the sentence settle before speaking again. "The $25,000 credit line that came from that meeting allowed me to build my first working prototype. Without that prototype, there would have been no early investors, no expansion, and certainly no Whitmore Technologies." The nearby guests exchanged glances again. I could sense the quiet shift in the room, like the slow turning of a spotlight. For years I had stood in the background at events like this, smiling politely while Robert accepted congratulations for the company we had built together. Tonight, for the first time, the attention in the room was not centered on him. Daniel looked around the ballroom briefly before returning his gaze to Robert. So when I walked into a service lounge tonight and found Margaret sitting alone, he said calmly, I realized something that surprised me. Robert blinked once. What was that? He asked. Daniel's expression remained polite, but there was a quiet firmness behind his voice when he answered. I realized that the most important person I have encountered this evening was not standing on this stage or speaking to investors. She was sitting quietly in a room down the hall where almost no one could see her. The statement settled across the ballroom like a soft but undeniable truth. And for the first time since the evening began, Robert Hayes did not seem entirely certain how to respond. The silence that followed Daniel's last words seemed to stretch across the ballroom like a slow wave rolling through the crowd. Conversations that had filled the room only minutes earlier had now faded into low whispers. I could see people leaning slightly toward one another, quietly asking questions about the woman standing beside the famous chief executive officer. It was a strange feeling to realize that dozens of strangers were suddenly studying my face, as if trying to place a name they had just heard for the first time. Robert stood very still in front of us. For a moment, he looked exactly the way he had during our early years of building the company together, when a difficult problem appeared without warning, and he had to solve it quickly before anyone noticed the uncertainty behind his confidence. But tonight the room was watching, and there was no easy way to move the attention somewhere else. Robert gave a short, polite laugh that sounded just a little too sharp. Well, he said, glancing briefly toward the nearby tables, I suppose we all owe Margaret some gratitude for being kind to a determined young entrepreneur many years ago. His tone suggested he hoped the moment would pass as a charming story from the past. But Daniel did not step away. Instead, he looked around the ballroom slowly, taking in the faces of the investors, the executives, and the guests who had gathered to celebrate Robert's success. Then he turned his attention back to Robert. Kindness was part of it, he said calmly. But that is not the whole story. The room grew even quieter. Daniel's voice carried easily through the air without needing to be raised. Margaret did more than listen to an idea. She helped me understand the financial structure that would make the project possible. She pointed out weaknesses in my proposal that no one else had even noticed. I felt a small warmth of embarrassment rise in my chest as he spoke, not because his words were untrue, but because I had never expected anyone to remember that conversation so clearly. Daniel continued speaking with the same steady calm. When the loan officer reviewed the application, Margaret stayed in the office after closing time to make sure the numbers made sense. She believed that if someone was willing to work hard enough for a dream, the least a bank could do was examine the possibility honestly. Several of the guests nodded again. A few of them were now looking directly at me with expressions that carried genuine respect rather than curiosity. Daniel paused for a moment and then added quietly, There is one more detail I have never forgotten. He turned slightly so that more of the nearby tables could hear him. When the credit line was finally approved, I asked Margaret why she had taken the time to help a complete stranger. She said something very simple. I remembered the moment instantly. The small office. The afternoon sunlight on the desk. A young man who looked both relieved and terrified at the same time because success suddenly felt possible. Daniel looked toward me briefly before repeating the words. She said that every successful company begins with someone who believes in a possibility before the world does. The sentence drifted gently across the ballroom. For a moment no one spoke at all. Robert shifted his weight. Again, clearly aware that the attention in the room had settled somewhere he had not intended. His eyes moved briefly toward the stage where the Hayes Digital Logistics logo still glowed above the presentation screen. Then he forced another tight smile. Well, he said carefully, I think we can all agree Margaret has always been generous with encouragement. Daniel regarded him for a moment with a calm expression that revealed nothing about his thoughts. Then he spoke again, his voice still polite, but carrying a quiet clarity that everyone nearby could hear. Encouragement is valuable, he said. But what Margaret gave me was something much more important. Robert blinked once. And what would that be? Daniel answered without hesitation. She treated an unknown engineer with the same respect she would give the president of a major company. A faint ripple of understanding passed through the crowd. People in business understood that kind of respect better than almost anyone. Daniel's eyes moved across the room again before returning to Robert. And tonight, he said calmly, I found that same woman sitting alone in a lounge down the hallway while the room celebrating success did not even know she was here. He let the words settle gently into the quiet air before adding one final sentence. I believe that deserves a little more attention than it has received so far this evening. I could feel the attention in the room shifting completely now. Only minutes earlier, I had been someone invisible, a quiet presence hidden behind a closed door down the hallway. Now the same room that had not known I existed was watching every movement I made. The band on the stage had stopped playing without anyone officially asking them to, and the soft hum of conversation had faded into a tense curiosity. Daniel Whitmore stood calmly beside me, as if this entire moment had unfolded exactly the way he expected. Robert, however, looked like a man who was carefully measuring every word he might say next. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket and gave a controlled smile toward the surrounding guests. Ladies and gentlemen, he said lightly, trying to regain the rhythm of the evening. I think we may have discovered an unexpected connection tonight. A few polite chuckles drifted from the nearest tables, but the sound did not carry far. Daniel watched Robert for a second before speaking. Again, it is more than a connection, he said. It is a story about where success actually begins. He turned slightly so more of the guests could hear him. Most people think success begins with a brilliant idea or a large investment. But sometimes it begins with something much smaller. A single person choosing to treat someone with respect when no one else does. I felt a gentle warmth spread across my chest as he spoke, not because I believed I deserved the attention, but because I suddenly realized how rarely anyone had spoken about those early years out loud. Daniel continued calmly. When Margaret helped me secure that first credit line, she did not know whether my idea would work. She had no guarantee that my company would ever grow into anything meaningful. She simply believed that if someone worked hard enough for a dream, that dream deserved a fair chance. A quiet murmur moved through the crowd. Investors, entrepreneurs, and executives understood the value of that kind of belief better than most people. Daniel took a small step forward and raised his glass slightly. Tonight this room is celebrating the success of Hayes Digital Logistics, he said. And that success is impressive. But I believe it is also worth recognizing the people who make success possible long before the spotlight ever arrives. Several guests began nodding openly now. I noticed that even some of Robert's closest partners were watching me with thoughtful expressions. Daniel turned back toward me with the same respectful calm he had shown since the moment he entered the lounge. Margaret, he said gently, you once told me that every successful company begins with someone who believes in possibility. I felt my cheeks warm slightly as I remembered the conversation. I remember saying something like that. I replied quietly. Daniel smiled. I have repeated those words to young entrepreneurs for 3 decades. He looked back toward the audience and lifted his glass a little higher. So tonight I would like to suggest something very simple. Before we continue celebrating the future of business, perhaps we should acknowledge one of the people who quietly helped shape it. A few hands began to clap. At first the applause was polite and scattered, but it grew stronger as more guests joined in. The sound rolled across the ballroom in a wave that echoed softly against the high ceiling. I stood there feeling both surprised and strangely calm, the way someone might feel when a long-forgotten chapter of their life suddenly returns to the present. Robert's expression had changed again. The tight control he usually maintained at events like this was beginning to slip, replaced by something more uncertain. He forced another smile toward the crowd, but the applause was not for him anymore. Daniel leaned slightly toward me and spoke quietly enough that only I could hear. Margaret, he said, I believe you have spent many years standing behind other people's success. He paused for a moment and then added with gentle certainty, perhaps tonight it is time the room finally sees you. The applause continued for several seconds, rolling gently across the ballroom before slowly fading into a quieter murmur of conversation. I stood there beside Daniel Whitmore, feeling an unfamiliar mixture of emotions, not pride exactly, but something calmer and steadier. For many years I had watched rooms like this from the edges, smiling politely, while others accepted recognition for work that had once belonged to both Robert and me. Tonight felt different, though not because of the applause itself. It felt different because for the first time in a very long while, someone had simply told the truth about the past. Daniel lowered his glass and turned slightly toward the guests again. The room grew quiet once more, the kind of respectful silence that appears when people expect something meaningful to be said. Success, he began calmly, is often measured by the companies we build or the numbers we place on financial reports. But the truth is that every success story is made possible by people who never appear in those reports. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that many of the executives in the room clearly understood. 30 years ago, he continued, Margaret Hayes gave a young engineer a chance when no one else would. She did not know whether my idea would work. She did not know whether my company would survive. She simply believed that every person deserves to have their idea heard. A few guests nodded quietly. Daniel turned toward Robert then, not with hostility, but with the same calm honesty that had filled the room all evening. Robert, he said politely, your company has achieved remarkable growth. Building something like Hayes Digital Logistics takes intelligence, determination, and courage. That success deserves to be celebrated. Robert gave a small stiff nod, clearly unsure where the conversation might go next. Daniel paused briefly before speaking again. But it is also important to remember the people who stood beside us during the years when success was still uncertain. He glanced toward me once more. People who believed in possibilities before anyone else did. The statement settled quietly across the room. Robert adjusted his jacket again, his confident posture returning slowly as he tried to regain control of the evening. Well, he said with a tight smile, Margaret has always been supportive. I am sure she is happy to see how far everything has come. I looked at him for a moment. His voice carried the same familiar tone I had heard countless times over the years, the tone that gently moved my role into the background of every conversation about the company we had built together. But tonight something inside me felt different. Not angry, not bitter, simply clear. Daniel stepped slightly to the side, giving me space as if he understood that the next words should come from me. The room waited quietly. I felt dozens of eyes watching. But for the first time the attention did not make me uncomfortable. It simply felt like another moment in a long story that had taken many years to unfold. Robert is right about one thing, I said calmly. My voice was steady and clear enough to carry across the nearby tables. I have always believed in supporting people who are working hard to build something meaningful. A few guests smiled politely, expecting the sentence to end there. But I continued. When Robert and I started our business, we worked side by side for many years. Those were not easy times. We wrote proposals late at night, balanced budgets on kitchen tables, and hoped that one day the company would grow into something larger than our small office. I paused for a moment, remembering those early years with surprising clarity. Tonight it is wonderful to see how far that dream has traveled. The room remained quiet. Then I added one final sentence, the thought that had settled in my mind as I stood in that small lounge earlier in the evening. But sometimes success changes the way people see the past. I offered a gentle smile, not directed at anyone in particular, but simply toward the room itself. Daniel lifted his glass again in quiet respect. Around us the music slowly began to play once more, soft and steady, as conversations gradually returned to the ballroom. Robert stood silently for a moment before turning back toward his guests, woman dressed in an elegant navy blue dress. She has short gray hair, neatly styled. Her expression is calm and dignified as she stands facing forward. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. She looks poised yet quietly strong. Character 2 is a 67-year-old white man wearing a tailored dark suit. He has short graying hair and a strong jawline. His expression is confident but tense as he stands facing forward. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. He looks formal and reserved. Scene 1. The showdown, a tense moment in the ballroom. The camera captures the two main characters, Margaret and Robert, standing across from each other in the center of the elegant, crowded room. The energy is charged with tension as Daniel Whitmore, the CEO, reveals the truth of Margaret's silent contributions to his success. Robert stands rigid, his face hard with disbelief, while Margaret remains calm but firm, a quiet strength emanating from her as the room watches the confrontation unfold. The crowd, once buzzing with casual chatter, now stands still, their gazes fixated on the couple, waiting for the next move. Scene 2. Margaret's quiet life. A serene, peaceful scene in a simple, cozy home. Margaret, dressed in a modest cardigan and jeans, sits at the kitchen table, sipping coffee while looking out the window. Her home is warm, lived in, filled with the memories of a life shared with Robert. Soft morning light filters through the curtains, casting gentle shadows on the walls. The camera focuses on her thoughtful expression as she stares at the photograph of her younger self, reflecting on years of hard work and sacrifices that no one ever truly saw. Scene 3. Robert's busy day. Robert, dressed in a sharp suit, is walking through a high-powered office building. He moves confidently through the sleek, modern space, shaking hands with executives and taking phone calls. His face is a mask of professionalism, hiding the strain of the emotional distance that has quietly crept into his life. As he enters a conference room, the door closes behind him, and the camera lingers on his tense expression, showing his struggle to balance his success with the personal cost it has taken. The fast-paced environment contrasts sharply with Margaret's quiet world, highlighting the divide between their daily lives. Scene 4. The tension grows. The tension between Margaret and Robert reaches its peak. In the background, Daniel Whitmore stands, a figure of calm authority, while the two main characters engage in a brief but intense confrontation. Robert is visibly uncomfortable, trying to maintain control of the situation, but Margaret holds her ground, her voice steady and strong. The camera focuses on their faces as they exchange a few sharp words, revealing the emotional gulf between them. The scene is heightened by the quiet, intense atmosphere, with the surrounding room's noise dimming as the confrontation unfolds. Scene 5. The turning point, a quiet, reflective moment after the emotional storm. Margaret, now alone in a room at the venue, sits quietly on a bench by a large window, her hands folded in her lap. The light outside has dimmed, and the night sky stretches wide over the city. The camera lingers on her thoughtful expression as she watches the distant city lights. In this peaceful moment, we see her strength and resilience, a woman who has endured much but never lost her sense of dignity. The scene conveys her quiet resolution, hinting at the emotional journey that lies ahead. Scene 6. The final truth. The final scene brings the emotional arc to its resolution. The camera focuses on Margaret standing in front of the gathered crowd, her expression calm and unwavering as she makes her final statement. Daniel, now standing by her side in solidarity, nods slightly, acknowledging her presence. The room, filled with powerful figures, now turns its gaze toward her, acknowledging her worth. Robert watches from a distance, his face a mixture of regret and realization. The camera slowly zooms in on Margaret's face, capturing the quiet strength that she has carried for years, her moment of recognition at last arriving.